It all began on the first night in the new apartment, a place she had chosen for its charm and tranquility. The building was old, with creaky floors and high ceilings, the kind of place that had a history, that had seen lives come and go. She loved that about it, the sense of being part of something larger, something with roots. But from the very beginning, there was something off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The first night after unpacking and settling into her new home, she was exhausted, her body aching for rest. She lay in bed, the unfamiliar sounds of the apartment settling around her. Soft creaks, distant pipes groaning, the gentle hum of the city outside her window. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt wrong, as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. She dismissed the feeling as just nerves, the anxiety of moving to a new place, but the unease wouldn't leave her. As she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were restless, filled with vague, unsettling images that she couldn't quite recall upon waking. The next morning, she woke early, the light just beginning to filter through the curtains. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a sense of something having passed through the room while she slept. She brushed it off, forcing herself to focus on the excitement of a new beginning. But as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger, more insistent. The apartment, which had felt warm and welcoming when she first saw it, now seemed cold, its shadows longer, darker, as if they were hiding something. Then, on the third night, she had the first real nightmare. She was lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when she felt the temperature in the room drop. It wasn't gradual. It was as though a cold wave had swept through the space, chilling her to the bone. She pulled the covers tighter around her, trying to shake the feeling. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just at the edge of her hearing. It was so soft that at first she thought it was her imagination, the remnants of a dream. But as she strained to listen, the whisper grew clearer, though the words were still indecipherable. It sounded like someone was standing just outside her bedroom door, murmuring something in a language she couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, her eyes darting to the door. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence of the apartment. She wanted to believe it was just a trick of her mind, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. The next day, she tried to laugh it off, telling herself that it was just the stress of the move, the unfamiliarity of the place. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The whispering returned, more insistent this time, as if it was coming from inside the walls, creeping through the cracks and corners of the room. The cold returned as well, seeping into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. She buried herself under the covers, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispering was relentless, growing louder and more agitated, until she could almost make out the words, though they still slipped through her mind like sand through her fingers. The fear took root in her then, a deep, primal terror that she couldn't explain. She began to dread the nights, knowing that the darkness would bring with it the cold and the whispers. Each evening, as the sun set and the shadows grew, the apartment seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing closer, the air thick with something she couldn't name. She began to notice other things, small, almost imperceptible changes. The shadows in the corners seemed to move when she wasn't looking, shifting and pulsing like something alive. The floorboards creaked in the dead of night, as if someone, or something, was walking through the apartment, just out of sight. The sense of unease grew stronger with each passing day, until it became a constant companion, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. She couldn't escape it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to let her guard down. And as the days turned into weeks, she found herself growing more and more isolated, cut off from the world outside. The apartment, which had once felt like a haven, now felt like a prison, a place where something dark and malevolent was slowly, steadily tightening its grip on her mind. And through it all, the whispers never stopped. The whispers became a nightly torment, a chilling symphony that played just beyond the edge of her consciousness. But it wasn't just the voices that disturbed her. Soon, she began to notice other things, small, inexplicable changes that slowly eroded her sense of reality. It started with the objects in her apartment, things she was certain she had left in one place, only to find them somewhere else. A book she had placed on the coffee table would appear on the kitchen counter. A chair she had pushed in would be slightly pulled out, as if someone had just been sitting there. At first, she thought she was just being forgetful, that the stress of the move was making her careless. But as the incidents grew more frequent, she began to question her sanity. One night, she woke suddenly from a deep sleep, her heart racing. The apartment was eerily silent, but something felt wrong. She sat up in bed, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness, and that's when she saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows at the foot of her bed. It was tall and thin, its outline blurred as if it were part of the darkness itself. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She told herself it had to have been a trick of the light, a fragment of a dream lingering in her waking mind. But the memory of it clung to her, leaving her unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. The dreams grew worse after that, more vivid and disturbing. She found herself in strange, dark places, abandoned buildings, fog-choked forests, endless hallways that twisted and turned in ways that defied logic. In each dream, the figure was there, always at the edge of her vision, never fully visible, but always present. It didn't speak, but its presence filled her with a deep, unshakable dread. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, her mind reeling from the intensity of the nightmares. The line between dream and reality began to blur, and she found herself questioning whether she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare. During the day, the apartment seemed to change, subtly but undeniably. The walls seemed to close in. The air grew heavier, and the shadows deepened. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The whispers, once confined to the night, began to creep into the daylight hours, soft and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. She would hear them while washing dishes, while folding laundry, even while brushing her teeth. The words were still unclear, but they filled her with a sense of dread, as though they were speaking of something terrible that was about to happen. Her sleep became increasingly restless, plagued by the same recurring nightmare. In it, she was wandering through her apartment, but it wasn't her apartment. It was darker, twisted, like a reflection seen in a cracked mirror. The walls were covered in strange, shifting shadows, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She would walk from room to room, searching for something she couldn't name, knowing that the figure was close behind her, following her every move. The dread would build and build until she could hardly breathe. And just as she felt the figure's cold presence right behind her, she would wake up, gasping for air, her body drenched in sweat. One evening, as she sat in her living room trying to read, she heard a soft, rustling sound coming from the hallway. She tensed, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was faint, like the whisper of fabric against the floor, and it seemed to be getting closer. She held her breath, straining to listen, and then she heard it again. Closer this time, just outside the door to the living room. She slowly turned her head, dread pooling in her stomach. But when she looked, the hallway was empty. The sound had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. It was as if the entire apartment was holding its breath, waiting. She tried to dismiss it, tried to go back to her book, but her eyes kept flicking back to the hallway, expecting to see something, or someone, emerging from the shadows. The fear gnawed at her, making it impossible to concentrate. Finally, she gave up and decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring her some relief. But as she made her way down the hallway, she felt it again. That cold, creeping sensation that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart skipping a beat. But the hallway was empty, as silent and still as a grave. That night, she had the worst nightmare yet. She was standing in her bedroom, the air around her thick with darkness. The door creaked open slowly, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure, its form clearer now, more defined. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and thin, its face obscured by shadows. But its eyes, those eyes were the only thing she could see clearly, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. It began to move toward her, slow and deliberate, its footsteps soft but echoing in her mind like the tolling of a distant bell. She tried to move, to run, but her body was frozen, rooted to the spot as the figure drew closer and closer. When she woke, the room was freezing, the cold air pressing down on her like a weight. The whispers were back, louder this time, urgent, insistent. She couldn't understand the words, but she knew they were meant for her, that the figure was trying to tell her something. She lay there, paralyzed by fear, listening to the voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped, leaving her in a silence so profound it rang in her ears. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too terrified to close her eyes, too afraid of what she might see if she did. By morning she was exhausted, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. The apartment, once a refuge, had become a nightmare, a place where reality and the surreal were intertwined in a web of fear and uncertainty. She knew she couldn't stay there much longer, but she also knew that leaving wouldn't solve the problem. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just in the apartment, it was in her, seeping into her thoughts, her dreams, her very soul. And deep down, she knew that the figure wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was something real, something that had found her, and that wouldn't stop until it had claimed her. As the days passed, the protagonist found herself slipping further into a dark and solitary existence. The outside world became a distant memory, overshadowed by the all-consuming fear that now ruled her life. She stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends and family. Her apartment, once a place of comfort, had become a prison, its walls closing in on her with every passing hour. The whispers were always there, just on the edge of her hearing, like a constant background noise that she couldn't escape. They followed her from room to room, growing louder at night, until they filled her mind with a cacophony of voices that she couldn't shut out. They seemed to speak of things she couldn't understand, ancient secrets and dark truths that made her skin crawl. The more she listened, the more she felt her sanity slipping away, as if the whispers were slowly eroding her sense of self. The figure in her dreams became a constant presence, no longer content to remain in the shadows. It stood at the foot of her bed every night, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. She could feel its gaze on her, even when she closed her eyes. A piercing, inescapable force that held her in place. Each night, it moved closer, inch by inch, till she could feel its breath on her skin, could almost make out the features of its face. But the moment she tried to focus, the details would slip away, leaving only a vague, nightmarish impression that lingered in her mind long after she woke. The boundary between her waking life and her dreams began to blur, the figure's presence bleeding into her daylight hours. She would catch glimpses of it in reflective surfaces, a shadow in the mirror, a fleeting image in the glass of a window. Always there, always watching. Her sense of reality became increasingly fragmented. She started doubting everything, her memories, her thoughts, her very perception of the world around her. She couldn't trust herself anymore. Couldn't be sure if what she was seeing was real or just another trick of her mind. Objects in her apartment seemed to change when she wasn't looking. A vase that had been on the dining table would appear on the kitchen counter. A photograph would be tilted at a different angle. Doors she knew she had closed would be slightly ajar. These changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they filled her with a deep, gnawing dread. She felt like she was losing her grip on reality, like the world around her was shifting, warping, becoming something else entirely. She stopped leaving the apartment altogether, too afraid of what might happen if she did. The outside world was no longer a refuge. It was foreign, hostile, full of dangers she couldn't name but could feel lurking just out of sight. She closed all the curtains, shut off all the lights, and barricaded herself inside, hoping that the darkness would keep the figure at bay. But it didn't work. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent, filling her mind with terrible thoughts, urging her to do things she knew she shouldn't. They told her to cut herself off from everyone, to isolate herself completely, to surrender to the darkness that was slowly enveloping her. As her isolation deepened, so did her paranoia. She began to suspect that the figure wasn't just haunting her, it was inside her, manipulating her thoughts, warping her perceptions. She could feel it moving through her mind, like a dark, insidious presence that she couldn't escape. It whispered to her in her own voice, planting seeds of doubt and fear, making her question her every move. She became convinced that the people she loved were part of it, that they were conspiring against her, trying to drag her into the darkness. She cut off all contact, blocking their calls, deleting their messages, convinced that they were trying to drive her mad. The few times she did venture out of her apartment, she was overwhelmed by the sensation that everyone was watching her. Their eyes followed her wherever she went, filled with a cold, calculating gaze that sent chills down her spine. Strangers on the street seemed to know her, their faces twisting into cruel smiles as she passed by. She could hear them whispering about her, their voices merging with the whispers in her mind, until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She started to see the figure in the faces of others, fleeting glimpses that made her heart race with terror. It was everywhere, in everyone, and there was no escape. Her reflection became a source of terror. Every time she looked in the mirror, she expected to see the figure standing behind her, its eyes glowing with that same cold light. But what she saw was worse. Her own reflection began to change, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. But with each passing day, the change became more pronounced. Her eyes looked hollow, sunken, as if the life was being drained out of her. Her skin grew pale, almost translucent, and her hair became dull and lifeless. But it was her expression that frightened her the most. It was not the face of someone alive, but of someone who had seen the darkness, who had been touched by it, and had been forever changed. It was the face of someone who was slowly losing their humanity, piece by piece. The isolation and fear took their toll, and she began to lose track of time. Days bled into nights, and nights into days, until they became a continuous, unending cycle of dread and despair. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, her mind consumed by the figure and the whispers. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in on her, the space shrinking until it felt like she was being suffocated. The shadows grew darker, thicker, as if they were alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy that filled the air with an oppressive weight. She could feel the figure's presence growing stronger, could sense it waiting, watching, just out of sight, biding its time. In her darkest moments, she considered ending it all, but the whispers wouldn't let her. They told her that there was no escape, that death wouldn't bring peace, only more darkness. They promised her that the figure would follow her, even into the afterlife, that it would never stop, never let her go. The fear of what awaited her on the other side was enough to keep her going, trapped in a cycle of terror and despair that she couldn't break free from. She was a prisoner in her own mind, caught in a web of fear and madness that was tightening with every passing moment. The figure, once a distant presence, was now a constant looming shadow in her life. She could feel it inside her, whispering in her thoughts, twisting her perceptions, turning her against herself. It was no longer just a figment of her nightmares. It was real, tangible, and it was consuming her from the inside out. She knew that if she didn't find a way to stop it, to escape its grasp, it would devour her completely, leaving nothing behind but an empty shell. But the more she tried to fight it, the stronger it became, feeding off her fear, growing more powerful with each passing day. She was trapped, caught in a battle she couldn't win, with an enemy she couldn't see but could feel in every fiber of her being. The descent into madness was not sudden, but rather a gradual, relentless erosion of her mind. Each day, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred further until the two were indistinguishable. The whispers in her mind, once soft and distant, had grown louder, more demanding, their words now clear and unmistakable. They spoke of darkness, of inevitability, of the futility of resistance. They told her she was marked, chosen, that the figure had claimed her and there was no escape. The fear that had taken root in her soul now bloomed into full-blown terror, a constant gnawing presence that shadowed her every thought, every breath. The figure no longer confined itself to her dreams. It began to appear in the waking world, a shadowy presence that stalked her every move. At first it was just glimpses, a dark shape in the corner of her eye, a fleeting shadow that vanished the moment she turned her head. But soon, it became bolder. She would see it, standing in the hallway, a tall, looming silhouette that filled the space with an unnatural darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its very presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She could feel its eyes on her, cold and calculating, filled with a malevolent intelligence that chilled her to the bone. The nights were the worst. As soon as the sun set, the apartment was plunged into a darkness that was more than just the absence of light. It was a living, breathing entity, thick and suffocating, filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. The figure would come to her then, no longer content to stand in the shadows. It would approach her bed, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in her mind like the tolling of a distant bell. She would lie there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or cry out. As it drew closer and closer, she could feel its cold breath on her skin, could hear the low, guttural growl that seemed to come from deep within its chest. The terror was all-consuming, a primal fear that seized her heart and refused to let go. Her mind began to fracture under the weight of the terror. She started to hear the figure's voice in her head, a low, insidious whisper that wormed its way into her thoughts, twisting them, corrupting them. It told her terrible things, things she didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. It spoke of death, of darkness, of the inevitable end that awaited her. It told her that she belonged to it, that she was its to claim, to consume. The voice was relentless, a constant presence that filled her every waking moment, leaving no room for anything else. It was as if the figure was inside her, merging with her until she could no longer tell where it ended and she began. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, had become a nightmare realm, a place where reality was warped and twisted beyond recognition. The walls seemed to breathe, the floors shifted beneath her feet, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to think, hard to move. The shadows had grown darker, thicker, until they seemed to take on a life of their own, writhing and twisting like living things. She would see faces in the darkness, twisted, malevolent visages that leered at her, mocking her fear. The figure was always there, a constant looming presence that watched her every move, waiting for the moment when she would finally break. She stopped sleeping, too afraid of what would happen if she closed her eyes. But the exhaustion took its toll, and eventually she would drift off, only to be plunged into a nightmare world where the figure reigned supreme. In her dreams, she would find herself in a dark, twisted version of her apartment, the walls closing in on her, the shadows reaching out to claim her. The figure would be there, its eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light, its voice a low, mocking whisper that filled her with dread. It would chase her through the endless, twisting corridors of her mind, always just a step behind, until she woke up gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Her grip on reality continued to slip. She began to see things that shouldn't exist, impossible things, terrifying things. The walls would bleed, dark, viscous blood that pooled on the floor and soaked into the carpet. The lights would flicker, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and writhe with a life of their own. Objects would move on their own, shifting and sliding across surfaces, as if pushed by unseen hands. The figure was always there, always watching, always waiting. It became a part of her, a dark, malevolent force that she couldn't escape. Couldn't fight. It was in her mind, in her thoughts, in her very soul, twisting her, corrupting her, turning her into something dark and twisted. She tried to resist, tried to fight back, but the figure was too strong, its hold on her too tight. It whispered to her in her own voice, planting seeds of doubt and fear, turning her against herself. She couldn't trust her own thoughts, couldn't trust her own senses. Everything was warped, distorted, filled with a dark, oppressive energy that drained her, weakened her. She was a puppet, her strings pulled by the figure, forced to dance to its dark, twisted tune. Her mind was a battleground, a place of darkness and despair where the figure reigned supreme, crushing her will, her spirit, her very soul. In her darkest moments, she would stand in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection, searching for some sign of the person she used to be, but all she saw was a stranger, a hollow shell of a woman who had been consumed by the darkness. Her eyes were empty, lifeless, filled with the same cold, malevolent light that she saw in the figure's eyes. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her hair dull and lifeless. She was no longer herself. She was a vessel, a conduit for the figure, a part of it, and it was a part of her. The realization filled her with a terror so profound that it shook her to her core, a deep, primal fear that there was no escape, that the figure had claimed her, body and soul. She could feel herself slipping further and further into the darkness, the light of her humanity flickering, fading. As the figure's influence grew stronger, she was trapped, caught in a downward spiral of terror and despair, with no way out, no escape. The figure was everywhere, in everything, its presence a constant oppressive weight that crushed her spirit, drained her will, left her empty and hollow. She was no longer fighting for her life. She was fighting for her soul, for the last shred of her humanity. But the battle was already lost. The figure had won, and there was nothing left but darkness. The terror that gripped her life had evolved into something far more insidious. A puzzle, a dark enigma that she felt compelled to solve, even as she knew it might lead to her undoing. The whispers that filled her mind began to change, no longer just incoherent murmurs, but fragmented pieces of a message, a code she was desperate to decipher. They spoke of a truth hidden within the shadows of her existence, a secret that, once uncovered, could either save her or damn her completely. The figure, too, seemed to communicate through these whispers, urging her to dig deeper, to unravel the mystery that had ensnared her. Her apartment became a maze of clues, each one more cryptic than the last. She discovered symbols scratched into the walls, hidden under layers of peeling paint. Symbols that seemed ancient, otherworldly, pulsating with a dark energy that made her skin crawl. Books that she had never noticed before appeared on her shelves, their pages filled with strange, indecipherable texts and haunting illustrations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking. She found old photographs tucked away in the corners of her drawers, images of people she didn't recognize but who seemed to be looking directly at her. Their eyes filled with a knowing, almost mocking expression. As she pieced together these clues, a pattern began to emerge, though it was fragmented, elusive, like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. The more she uncovered, the more the pieces refused to fit together, twisting and warping in her mind until the picture they formed was a grotesque distortion of reality. She couldn't shake the feeling that the puzzle was a trap, designed to lure her deeper into the darkness, to drive her further into madness. But she was too far gone to stop now. Her mind was obsessed, consumed by the need to understand, to solve the mystery that had taken over her life. The figure, once a silent observer, began to take a more active role in her torment. It would appear in her dreams, standing over her as she tried to decipher the symbols, its eyes glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. It would whisper to her, its voice a low, rumbling growl that filled her with dread, telling her that she was close, so close to the truth, but that she would never escape it once she found it. The dreams became more vivid, more disturbing, filled with images of her own death, her own descent into madness. And always, always, the figure was there, watching, waiting as if it knew the outcome before she did. Her waking hours were no better. The apartment seemed to change around her, the walls closing in, and the shadows growing darker, more oppressive, as if the space itself was alive, reacting to her growing fear and desperation. Objects would move on their own, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense, yet felt deliberate, purposeful. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their voices overlapping, merging into a single, overwhelming cacophony that filled her mind with dread. She began to see things that shouldn't exist. Ghostly figures in the corners of her vision, faces staring back at her from reflective surfaces, their eyes filled with the same dark knowledge that haunted her dreams. The symbols and messages she uncovered began to take on a life of their own, appearing in places she hadn't looked, as if they were leading her somewhere, guiding her toward a revelation she wasn't sure she wanted to face. She would wake in the middle of the night to find herself standing in front of a mirror, her hand moving of its own accord, tracing symbols into the glass with trembling fingers, symbols she didn't understand but felt compelled to draw. Her reflection in the mirror seemed to watch her with a cold, detached interest. Its eyes dark and empty, as if it were no longer her reflection, but something else. Something that had taken her place. She began to uncover fragments of a dark history, tales of those who had lived in the apartment before her, all of whom had met tragic, inexplicable ends. There were stories of disappearances, suicides, and madness, each one more chilling than the last. The records were incomplete, the details murky, but one thing was clear. There was a pattern, a cycle of horror that repeated itself, over and over, and now she was caught in it. The figure had been there all along, haunting the apartment, claiming its inhabitants one by one, and now it had come for her. Her investigation led her to the discovery of a name, an old tenant who had vanished without a trace years before. This tenant, it seemed, had been obsessed with the same symbols, the same whispers, and had left behind a journal filled with ramblings about a dark presence, a figure that had stalked them through their dreams. The entries were disjointed, the handwriting growing more frantic, more unhinged as the journal progressed. The final entry was a single line, scrawled in large, jagged letters. "The truth will destroy you." The words burned into her mind, a warning she couldn't ignore, but was powerless to heed. The more she uncovered, the more the whispers urged her on, promising answers, but at the cost of her sanity. She became convinced that the figure was not just haunting her, it was manipulating her, leading her toward a conclusion she couldn't escape. The symbols, the whispers, the figure itself were all pieces of a larger puzzle, a puzzle that, once completed, would reveal a truth too terrible to comprehend. The atmosphere in the apartment grew more oppressive with each passing day. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the walls closing in on her, as if the space itself was trying to swallow her whole. She could feel the figure's presence growing stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of her mind, twisting her thoughts, warping her perceptions. The whispers became a constant, deafening roar in her ears, filling her with a sense of impending doom, as if the truth she sought was on the verge of being revealed. But with each piece of the puzzle she uncovered, the sense of dread only deepened. The truth was there, just out of reach, but it was a truth she knew she couldn't bear to face. The figure was not just a manifestation of her fears. It was something far darker, something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for her, drawing her into its web. She was trapped, caught in a cycle of terror and madness, with no way out, no escape, and the puzzle was the key, the final piece that would unlock the full horror of her fate. The realization hit her like a cold wave of terror. The puzzle was never meant to be solved. It was a trap, a cruel game played by the figure, designed to drive her mad, to break her completely. The symbols, the whispers, the clues, They were all part of the figure's plan, a way to lure her deeper into the darkness, to make her doubt everything she knew until she was completely under its control. The truth, the terrible truth, was that she had been doomed from the start, chosen by the figure, marked for madness, and now there was no turning back. The puzzle was complete, but the answer it revealed was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. The figure had been waiting for her, watching her, feeding off her fear, and now it was ready to claim her. She was alone, trapped in the darkness, with no one to help her, no way to escape. The truth had destroyed her, just as the journal had warned, and now all that was left was the figure, the darkness, and the endless, unbearable terror of knowing that it was all real, that she was lost, and that there was no escape from the nightmare she had unwittingly unleashed. The moment of reckoning arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike, shattering what remained of her fragile sanity. The clues, the whispers, the endless nightmares, they had all led to this, the inescapable confrontation with the heart of the darkness that had consumed her life. That night, the air in the apartment was thick with a suffocating tension, a sense of something terrible and final about to unfold. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, twisting and writhing as if eager to reveal the horror they had been hiding. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she knew there was nowhere left to run. The figure had been leading her to this moment all along. And now, it was time to face the truth. As she sat in her darkened bedroom, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they filled her mind with a deafening roar. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, yet their meaning was clear. The time had come. Her heart pounded in her chest, the fear clawing at her insides like a living thing, but she forced herself to move, to rise from the bed and step into the hallway. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon filtering through the curtains. The shadows stretched out before her like a dark, gaping maw, and she knew that the figure was waiting for her, just beyond the edge of the light. With each step she took, the temperature in the apartment dropped, the air growing colder, more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in around her, the darkness thickening until it was almost tangible, pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers intensified, merging into a single, low hum that vibrated through her skull, making it hard to think, hard to focus. But she pressed on, her feet moving of their own accord, drawn toward the figure that had haunted her dreams, that had twisted her reality into a nightmare from which there was no escape. As she approached the living room, she saw it, the figure, standing in the center of the room, its form a dark, towering silhouette against the pale light of the moon. It was taller than she remembered, its limbs long and twisted, its outline blurred as if it were made of shadows and smoke. Its eyes glowed with that familiar cold light, two pinpoints of malevolence that bore into her, stripping away the last vestiges of her courage. She wanted to scream, to turn and run, but her body refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a fear so profound, it felt like her very soul was being pulled from her body. The figure began to move toward her, slow and deliberate, its footsteps echoing in the silence like the tolling of a distant bell. With each step it took, the shadows around it seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive, reaching out for her, beckoning her closer. She could feel the cold radiating off it, a bone-deep chill that seeped into her skin, her bones, freezing her from the inside out. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic, a cacophony of voices urging her to give in, to surrender to the darkness that was now so close she could almost touch it. As the figure drew nearer, she saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to suck in the light around it, distorting the space in front of her. The eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, were the only features, and they held her in place, locking her in their cold, malevolent gaze. She could feel the figure's presence pressing down on her, suffocating her, filling her with a terror so intense it was almost unbearable. Her mind screamed for her to run, to fight, to do anything to escape, but her body remained frozen, trapped in the figure's grip. The figure stopped, just inches away from her, its towering form blocking out the light, casting her into complete darkness. She could feel its breath on her skin, cold and damp, and the sound of its low, guttural growl rumbled through her chest like thunder. The whispers had merged into a single, terrible voice. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through her mind with the force of a sledgehammer. It spoke to her, not in words she could understand, but in raw emotion, filling her with a despair so deep it felt like she was drowning in it. And then, the figure reached out, its long, twisted fingers brushing against her skin. The touch was like ice, burning cold that sent a jolt of pain through her body. But she couldn't move, couldn't pull away. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers digging into her flesh, and she could feel the darkness seeping into her, poisoning her, corrupting her from the inside out. The pain was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the terror that filled her mind, the knowledge that she was losing herself, that the figure was taking her piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The figure's face, or the void where its face should have been, was now inches from hers, its eyes burning into her soul. She could feel its thoughts, dark and twisted, merging with her own, filling her with images of death, of madness, of endless, suffocating darkness. The terror was overwhelming, consuming her, breaking her, until there was nothing left but the figure and the darkness. She wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came out. The figure's grip tightened further, and she could feel herself slipping away, her mind unraveling, her soul being pulled into the void. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear it any longer, the figure spoke. Its voice was a low, rumbling growl, like the sound of rocks grinding together deep beneath the earth. It spoke a single word, a word that reverberated through her mind with the force of an earthquake, shattering the last remnants of her sanity. The word was her name, but twisted, distorted, as if it had been dragged through the darkness and corrupted beyond recognition. The sound of it filled her with a terror so profound it felt like her heart would stop, but it also brought with it a terrible realization. The figure knew her. It had always known her. It had been waiting for her, and now it had come to claim what was rightfully its. The figure's grip on her tightened one last time, and she felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest, as if something had pierced her heart. The darkness around her intensified, closing in until there was nothing left but the figure's eyes, burning into her soul. And then, with a final, agonizing scream that echoed through the darkness, she was pulled into the void, swallowed by the shadows, lost forever in the endless, suffocating terror that had consumed her life. The apartment was silent, the shadows still, the air thick with the lingering presence of the figure. The room where she had stood was empty, save for a faint, echoing whisper that faded into the darkness. The figure was gone, but its presence remained, a dark, malevolent energy that would haunt the apartment for years to come, waiting for the next soul to claim. And as the last remnants of her presence faded into the shadows, the apartment settled into an eerie silence. The only sound, the faint creak of the floorboards, as if something unseen was still moving through the darkness, waiting, watching, biding its time. The confrontation had left her shattered, her mind a fractured landscape of fear and despair. But the horror was far from over. In the aftermath of that night, she found herself standing at the edge of an abyss, an unfathomable darkness that seemed to stretch on forever, a void that beckoned her to fall, to surrender completely to the terror that had claimed her life. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered, a shadow that clung to her like a second skin, whispering in her ear, pulling her deeper into the darkness with every passing moment. The apartment, once a place of safety, had become a prison of horrors, its walls echoing with the memories of the encounter. Every corner was steeped in shadow, every reflection distorted, every sound amplified into a cacophony of terror. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as if the very atmosphere was charged with the lingering malevolence of the figure. The whispers, though quieter now, were still there, an ever-present reminder that she was not alone, that the darkness was watching, waiting for the moment to drag her back into its depths. Her body moved through the apartment like a ghost, her mind detached, lost in a fog of despair. She no longer recognized herself in the mirror. Her reflection was a stranger, a hollow, lifeless version of the person she once was. Her eyes, once bright and filled with life, were now empty, darkened by the shadows that had taken root in her soul. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as if the blood had been drained from her body, leaving her a mere shell, a vessel for the darkness that had consumed her. The figure's grip on her was absolute, even in its absence. She could feel it inside her, its presence a cold, festering wound that refused to heal. It whispered to her in the dead of night, its voice a low, insidious murmur that filled her with a sense of dread so profound it made her bones ache. It told her that she was marked, that the darkness had claimed her, and there was no escape. The figure had taken something from her, something vital, something she couldn't name, and in its place, it had left a void, a deep, yawning emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. The apartment itself seemed to shift and change, as if it were alive, reacting to her fear. The walls would close in, the shadows would stretch out, reaching for her, and the floors would creak and groan as if something unseen was moving beneath them. She began to see things that shouldn't exist, phantom figures in the corners of her vision, dark shapes that slithered across the floor, faces in the walls, twisted and grotesque, their eyes filled with malice. The boundaries between reality and nightmare had dissolved completely, leaving her trapped in a world where the two were one and the same. She became obsessed with the idea of the abyss, the dark void that she felt pulling at her soul. It was a concept that haunted her dreams, a place of infinite darkness where the light of the world could not reach. In her nightmares, she would find herself standing at the edge of this abyss, looking down into the inky blackness, feeling the cold air rising from its depths, carrying with it the stench of decay and death. The figure would be there, standing behind her, its presence a towering shadow, urging her to take the final step, to surrender to the darkness, to let go of whatever fragile hold she had left on her sanity. The abyss called to her during her waking hours as well. She would stand at the window, staring out at the world beyond. But all she could see was darkness, a vast, empty void that stretched out before her, beckoning her to step into it. The whispers in her mind urged her on, telling her that the only way to escape the terror was to embrace it, to give in to the darkness, to let it consume her completely. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting, a way to end the endless cycle of fear and despair, a way to find peace in the void. But the thought of the abyss also filled her with a deep, primal fear, a fear that gripped her heart and refused to let go. The abyss was not just a place, it was a state of being, a final surrender to the darkness that had been chasing her. She knew that if she gave in, if she allowed herself to fall, there would be no coming back. The darkness would claim her completely, erasing whatever was left of her, leaving nothing but an empty shell, a puppet for the figure to control. The terror of that realization was almost unbearable, a weight that pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. She began to see the abyss everywhere, in the dark corners of her apartment, in the reflection of her own eyes, in the spaces between her thoughts. It was an ever-present void, a constant reminder of the darkness that had taken root in her soul. She could feel it growing stronger, pulling at her, dragging her closer to the edge. The figure was gone, but its influence remained, a shadow that loomed over her, casting everything in a dark, oppressive light. The final confrontation with the abyss came in the dead of night, when the apartment was silent, the air thick with the weight of the darkness. She had been awake for days, unable to sleep, her mind a chaotic mess of fear and despair. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, filling her mind with thoughts of the void, of the darkness that awaited her. She knew that the time had come, that there was no more running, no more hiding. The abyss was calling, and she could no longer resist. She stood in the center of her living room, the darkness pressing in on her from all sides, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The air was cold, filled with the stench of decay, and she could feel the darkness rising from the floor, wrapping around her legs, pulling her down. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her to give in, to surrender, to let go. She closed her eyes, feeling the cold air on her skin, the darkness pressing down on her, suffocating her, and she knew that this was the end. The abyss was before her, a vast, empty void that stretched out into infinity. She could feel its pull, a deep, irresistible force that drew her closer, closer to the edge. The figure was there, standing beside her, its presence a dark, towering shadow, its eyes glowing with that cold, malevolent light. It didn't speak, didn't move, but she could feel its thoughts, could hear its voice in her mind, telling her that it was time, that she had no choice, that the darkness had already claimed her. With a final, shuddering breath, she opened her eyes and looked into the abyss. The darkness was all-consuming, a void that swallowed everything, leaving nothing behind. She could feel herself slipping, her mind unraveling, her soul being pulled into the void, and she knew that there was no escape, no turning back. The figure's grip tightened, and she could feel its cold presence inside her, twisting her, corrupting her, pulling her down into the darkness. And then, with a final desperate scream, she let go. The darkness surged forward, swallowing her whole, pulling her into the abyss. The last thing she saw was the figure's eyes, glowing with that cold, malevolent light, as the darkness closed in around her, suffocating her, consuming her. The abyss had claimed her, and there was nothing left but the void, an endless, suffocating darkness that stretched out into infinity. The apartment was silent, the darkness still, the air thick with the lingering presence of the abyss. The room where she had stood was empty, save for a faint echoing whisper that faded into the darkness. The abyss was gone, but its presence remained, a dark, malevolent energy that would haunt the apartment for years to come, waiting for the next soul to claim. And as the last remnants of her presence faded into the shadows, the apartment settled into an eerie silence, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards, as if something unseen was still moving through the darkness, waiting, watching, biding its time. The abyss had taken her, or so it seemed. Yet, as the darkness enveloped her, there was no finality, no true sense of ending, only a strange, lingering uncertainty, as if the story wasn't quite over. She found herself drifting through the void, suspended in a place where time and space had no meaning. The cold, oppressive weight of the darkness pressed in on her from all sides, but there was no pain, no fear, only a numbing emptiness, a void that stretched on forever. And yet, in the deepest recesses of her mind, something stirred, a flicker of consciousness that refused to be extinguished. She couldn't say how long she remained in this state, floating in the abyss, her thoughts fragmented, her sense of self dissolving into the darkness. Minutes could have passed, or perhaps years. The concept of time was meaningless here, but gradually she became aware of a change, a subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. The darkness, once absolute and all-consuming, began to recede, thinning out like a dissipating fog. Shapes and shadows formed in the distance, indistinct and shifting, as if the abyss was giving way to something else, something new and yet hauntingly familiar. She found herself standing in her apartment once again, the familiar surroundings somehow strange and distorted. The room was exactly as she remembered it, the furniture in its place, the walls adorned with the same pictures and decorations, but everything felt off, as if she were looking at a photograph that had been slightly blurred, the edges of reality smudged and unclear. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, the silence thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint, distant echoes of the whispers that had haunted her for so long. Her body felt disconnected, as if she were observing herself, from a distance, a puppet on strings being guided by an unseen force. She moved through the apartment in a daze, her mind struggling to grasp what had happened, to reconcile the conflicting memories and sensations that flooded her thoughts. The figure, the abyss, the terror, it all seemed so real. And yet here she was, back in the place where it had all begun, as if nothing had changed. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted. Something fundamental had altered in her perception of reality. She reached out to touch the wall, and her hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The realization hit her like a cold wave of terror. She wasn't really here. This place, this version of her apartment, was not real. It was a construct, a shadow of the world she once knew, created by the darkness that had consumed her. The whispers grew louder, mocking her, taunting her with the knowledge that she was trapped, caught in a liminal space between life and death, reality and nightmare. The figure had taken her, and now she was its prisoner, bound to this shadowy existence for eternity. But even as the despair threatened to overwhelm her, a spark of defiance flared within her. She had been through too much, faced too many horrors to simply give up now. If this was a nightmare, then she would find a way to wake up. If this was the abyss, then she would find a way to climb out. The figure had not won, not yet. She was still here, still conscious, still fighting, and as long as she had that, there was hope. She began to move through the apartment with purpose, searching for a way out. A crack in the fabric of this twisted reality that might lead her back to the real world. But the apartment was a labyrinth, its corridors twisting and turning in impossible ways, leading her in circles, always bringing her back to the same starting point. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, shifting and changing before her eyes, as if the space itself was alive, responding to her fear, her desperation. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more frantic, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices that threatened to drown out her thoughts. But she pushed on, driven by the need to escape, to find some way out of this nightmare. As she rounded a corner, she came face to face with a mirror, its surface cracked and distorted, reflecting her image back at her in fragments. She stared at her reflection, expecting to see the hollow, lifeless version of herself that had haunted her in the real world. But what she saw was worse. Her reflection was not her. It was the figure, its eyes glowing with that familiar cold light, its form shifting and warping as it stared back at her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The figure wasn't just a separate entity, it was her, or at least a part of her, the darkness that had taken root in her soul, now fully manifested, fully in control. The figure in the mirror smiled, a slow, cruel smile that sent chills down her spine. It raised a hand, and she watched in horror as her own hand moved in perfect synchronization, as if they were one and the same. The connection was undeniable, unbreakable. And with it came the terrible understanding that she could never truly escape the darkness, because it was a part of her, had always been a part of her. The figure was not just a manifestation of her fears, it was her shadow self, the embodiment of all the darkness, all the fear, all the madness that had consumed her. The mirror shattered, and the darkness surged forward, enveloping her once again. But this time, she didn't fight it. She let it take her, let it pull her back into the abyss. Not out of defeat, but out of acceptance. The darkness was hers, and she was its. The figure had claimed her, but she had also claimed the figure. They were one and the same, two halves of the same whole, and together they were stronger. The fear, the terror, the despair, they were all still there, but they no longer controlled her. She had faced the abyss, faced the darkness, and she had emerged not as a victim, but as something new, something more. The whispers faded, replaced by a deep, resonant silence, the kind of silence that comes after a storm. The darkness receded, and she found herself standing in her apartment once again, but this time it was different. The edges of reality were still blurred, the shadows still long and twisted, but there was a sense of peace, a calmness that hadn't been there before. She looked around, taking in the familiar surroundings, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt a sense of control, of power. The figure was still with her, but it was no longer a separate entity. It was part of her, integrated into her very being. The apartment was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary, a place where she could coexist with the darkness, where she could find balance between the light and the shadow. The terror, the fear, the madness, they were all still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but they no longer held sway over her. She had faced the abyss, and she had survived. She had found a way to navigate the darkness, to harness it, to make it her own. But the story was not over. The shadow still whispered, the darkness still lingered, and there was always the possibility that it could rise up again, stronger, more insistent. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, a constant presence in the back of her mind. The terror she had faced was not gone, only subdued, and she knew that there would be more battles to come, more moments when the darkness would try to reclaim her. But she was ready. She had faced the abyss and had emerged stronger, more resilient, more in control. The apartment was quiet now, the air still, the shadows calm, but as she looked out the window, she saw the darkness beyond, vast and endless, stretching out into infinity. The world outside was still a place of light and shadow, of hope and despair, of reality and nightmare. And she was ready to face it all, to walk the line between the two, knowing that the darkness would always be with her, but that she would never let it consume her again. As she turned away from the window, the whispers began again, soft and distant, a reminder that the story was far from over. But she smiled, a small knowing smile, and walked into the shadows, unafraid, ready to embrace whatever came next. The terror, the fear, the mystery, they were all part of the same endless cycle, and she was now a part of it too. The darkness had claimed her, but she had also claimed the darkness, and in that balance, she had found her strength. The abyss was always there, just beyond the edge of her vision, but it no longer held the power it once did. She was in control now, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. The story ended, but the echoes of it remained, a haunting reminder that the darkness is always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment when it can rise again. But she was no longer afraid. She had faced the abyss, and she had survived. And whatever came next, she would face it with the same quiet strength, the same calm resolve, knowing that she had already faced the worst that the darkness could offer, and had emerged on the other side, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. The shadows whispered, the darkness lingered, but she was at peace, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the terror was never truly over, but that she was ready for it, whatever form it might take.